Sounds like Grand Rapids. But it's an audience that's not.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you.
Hello, Rob. Hi, Mark. See you. Morning, or good afternoon, everyone, and especially to Michael's family. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center and friend of Michael Adler. And I especially want to recognize Michael's sister, Ellen, his brother-in-law, Barry, and his girlfriend, Ira, who traveled again from Germany, or have you been back since? Who stayed here, yes, who did make it just after Michael passed. A few weeks before Michael died, Andrew Seeley and I went to have breakfast with him in his Georgetown home. Though he was clearly ill, his eyes gleamed, he had on a starched shirt, and he served us a full breakfast, a little bit of which he ate. He was optimistic about the future, and that's how I think we should remember him. Whatever happens when we hit the November 24th deadline for the Iran nuclear deal, some of my own interest in it has dimmed because Michael won't be telling me about it and because I won't be able to share his excitement. The Wilson Center has had many scholars and has many now. But whether because of his talent, his personality, or the incredible impact of his expertise, Michael stood out. We honor his legacy today. And more specifically, we wanted to do something else, so we will be putting up a plaque near the library where Michael spent countless hours to commemorate more permanently his contributions to the center and to his beloved subject, the Iran nuclear deal. There's also a picture of Michael hanging in the library. It's located in the gallery to the left of the library entrance, and you are welcome to visit it today. Staff will be on hand to direct you to the space. We have the perfect panel here today to celebrate Michael. Rob Litvak, who is the Center's Vice President for Scholars, and one of our featured panelists, will say more about Mark and David in a moment. But I will say that, yeah, they're smart, yeah, they're well-known, but just remember they wrote some of their best books right here at the Wilson Center. And they're going to write their next best books right here at the Wilson Center. Rob served on the National Security Council, some of you know this, as Director of Non-Proliferation in the Clinton administration. That was in another century, folks. And he has just put out a very important monograph on Iran's nuclear chess. I can think of no better tribute to Michael than the conversation we'll have today. Only one thing is missing in that conversation: Michael. At the close of our discussion, please join us for a reception in the Wilson Center dining room, which is right here on the 6th floor. Staff will direct you. And now let me just say one more time how much we loved Michael, and I'll turn the program over to Rob Litvak. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jane. It is fitting that we honor Michael today by addressing the vital issue on which he worked with such passion and determination in his final years. Michael is missed for so many reasons: his friendship and collegial presence here, the integrity of his work, his clarity of thought. That this panel includes two distinguished journalists who, like Michael, were Wilson Center Fellows is particularly apt. On my left, David Sanger, a national security correspondent in the New York Times, and Mark Mazzetti, also a national security correspondent with the Times. David was a public policy scholar at the center, and he wrote his book, The Inheritance: The World Obama Confronts and the Challenge to American Power. Mark Mazzetti, more recently with us, wrote The Way of the Knife: The CIA, a Secret Army, and a War at the Ends of the Earth. Not long ago, a meeting on Iran's nuclear challenge would have focused on the possibility of U.S. airstrikes on Iran. Now, nuclear diplomacy is playing out against the backdrops of U.S. airstrikes against ISIS in tacit alignment with Iran. With the November 24th negotiating deadline approaching, U.S. and Iranian negotiators just met in Oman to narrow the gap between the two sides. And beforehand, President Obama wrote to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, urging him not to miss an historic opportunity. So what are the prospects for a nuclear deal? The division of labor on this panel is that I'll frame the nuclear issue within the broader context of U.S.-Iranian relations. David Sanger will follow with a more detailed assessment of the nuclear diplomacy between Iran and the P5+1, that is, the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany. And then Mark Mazzetti will conclude by widening the optic to assess how the region's tumultuous regional developments, particularly the war against ISIS, will affect the nuclear negotiations. After these initial presentations, we'll have an exchange among the three of us and then open the floor to questions. In theory, an agreement to resolve the Iranian nuclear challenge should be a straightforward trade-off between technology and transparency. Iran would retain a limited nuclear program under international safeguards in return for the lifting of economic sanctions. Technical details, such as numbers of permissible centrifuges, the scope of international inspections, and a timetable of sanctions relief based on Iranian compliance, could be readily worked out. On technical grounds, such an agreement would fall within the declared U.S. and Iranian positions. Iran's nuclear program is determined and incremental, but it's not the Manhattan Project. That is a crash program to acquire a weapon in the face of an existential threat. The dilemma is that Iran has mastered uranium enrichment. Centrifuges that can spin to produce low-enriched uranium for nuclear power reactors can keep spinning to yield highly enriched uranium for bombs. For this reason, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency asserted that any country that has attained this level of technological advancement is a virtual nuclear weapon state. From a national security perspective, a nuclear hedge, is Iran's strategic sweet spot, maintaining the potential of a nuclear option while avoiding the regional and international costs of actual weaponization. As former President Rafsanjani put it, as long as we can enrich uranium and master the nuclear fuel cycle, we don't need to do anything else. Our neighbors will be able to draw the proper conclusions. President Obama has declared that the U.S. objective is to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. By drawing this red line, preventing weaponization, the President has signaled that the United States would not launch a preventive military action to deny Iran any nuclear hedge option. This is the main point of contention between President Obama and his congressional critics and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who want a full rollback of Iran's uranium enrichment program to deny Iran any hedge. Since the P5+1's nuclear diplomacy with Iran is focused on bounding, not eliminating Iran's uranium enrichment program, the Tehran regime will retain the option, a hedge for a nuclear weapon. The major stumbling block in the negotiations has been the scale of the uranium enrichment program that Iran would retain under an agreement. The number of centrifuges and their sophistication, as we will hear from David, are key to extending the timeline for a potential breakout. That is the number of months Iran would need to enrich weapons-grade fissile material if the Tehran regime made the strategic decision to weaponize. The U.S. position is that this breakout period for converting a hedge into a weapon should be long enough, at least 12 months, for the United States to have sufficient strategic warning to mobilize an international response. In other words, an agreement should not just leave Iran a screwdriver turn away from a bomb. Between these 2 points on the technology continuum, hedge versus weapon, Iran and the United States should be able to work out an agreement. The hard reality, of course, is that the nuclear impasse has so far proved intractable because of its quintessentially political character. As I argue in my new monograph, Iran's Nuclear Chess, for both Iran and the United States, the nuclear issue is a proxy for a more fundamental debate. This embedded status of the nuclear question remains the key determinant of whether nuclear diplomacy can prove successful. In Iran, the nuclear issue is a surrogate for the defining debate over the country's future relationship with the outside world. Whether, in former President Rafsanjani's words, the Islamic Republic is a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. In America, Iran's nuclear challenge has also been a proxy for a more fundamental debate about the threat posed by rogue states in the post-9/11 era. The Obama administration dropped the term rogue state used by the Bush administration and instead called Iran an outlier. The rogue rubric had connoted states whose ruling regimes were beyond the pale, essentially irredeemable, that their threatening behavior was inextricably linked to the character of their regimes. This argument was central to the Bush administration's case for preventive war in Iraq. By contrast, the outlier rubric was explicitly intended to suggest that a path lay open for Iran to rejoin the community of nations if the Tehran regime complied with its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Yet, the tension between the competing objectives of regime change and behavior change continues to churn the U.S. policy debate. Hence, a major criticism of Obama's nuclear diplomacy is that it does not address other threatening behavior, such as Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism, that derives from the character of the Tehran regime. A significant but unremarked conclusion of the controversial 2007 National Intelligence Estimate on Iran was the finding that Tehran's decisions are guided by a cost-benefit approach rather than a rush to a weapon, irrespective of the political, economic, and military costs. This analysis countered the occasional depiction of Iran as an undeterrable, essentially irrational rogue state. President Obama has questioned whether, as he put it, the Iranian regime's ideological commitment to nuclear weapons is such that they're not making a simple cost-benefit analysis on this issue. But when then asked whether the Iranian regime was messianic or rational, President Obama said that Iranian decision-making over the past 3 decades indicates that the clerics, quote, care about the regime's survival, close quote. Obama has further argued that the crippling pressure of sanctions, grinding the Iranian economy to a halt, presents the Tehran regime with the opportunity to make a strategic calculation to defer a decision to weaponize. The paradox of nuclear diplomacy with the Tehran regime is captured in an anonymous quip about the country. Iran does not respond to pressure, but without pressure, Iran does not respond. President Hassan Rouhani, a pragmatic centrist, campaigned on a platform of resolving the nuclear issue to end the country's isolation and the punishing international sanctions that have weakened the economy. While acquiescing to Rouhani's revitalized nuclear diplomacy in the wake of his June 2013 electoral mandate, Supreme Leader Khamenei remains the final arbiter of any prospective agreement. His decision will hinge on how he manages the unresolved tension in Iran's competing identities: revolutionary state, ordinary country. Economic sanctions, whose effects are now compounded by the drop in the price of oil, brought Iran to the negotiating table. And they will crucially affect the Supreme Leader's calculus of decision to accept or reject terms for a comprehensive agreement that meaningfully bounds Iran's nuclear infrastructure. That strategic calculation will be based on whether the economic benefits of an agreement through sanctions relief outweigh the political costs of alienating the core hardline interest groups, especially the Revolutionary Guard, upon which the regime's survival depends. So here we are then. As the November 24th negotiating deadline approaches, there are 3 possible outcomes: break through, break down, or muddling through. A breakthrough that strikes the right balance by hedging the hedge, so to speak, would give each side a winning narrative. The Tehran regime could claim that it stood up to the bullying of the United States to defend its right to enrich uranium, thereby preserving its hedge. It won meaningful sanctions relief and fended off efforts to link the nuclear issues to other issues. The Obama administration could claim that it has kept a latent Iranian capability latent by extending the breakout period for potential weaponization. But the Supreme Leader fears that a nuclear accord could put Iran on a slippery slope of demands from the West for additional policy changes, and for that reason, now that we're at the crunch point, Khamenei may balk. A breakdown in negotiations would not inherently push Iran into a nuclear breakout. Iran has no immediate national security imperative to acquire nuclear weapons. The Tehran regime would retain a hedge, keeping the weapons option open while avoiding the international and regional fallout of overt weaponization. But in the event of a diplomatic breakdown, the possibility of military action would invariably again come to the fore. That Obama's red line on weaponization pushes off a decision on the use of force is a reflection of how unattractive that option would be. That openly debated option on the table would be the most telegraphed punch in history, and it runs up against major liabilities. To begin with, it would not end the program, but merely delay it for a few years. As a former IAEA director put it, you can't bomb knowledge. Further, even a so-called limited strike could well escalate into a general war. Khamenei has warned that U.S. military action would lead to Iranian retaliation against U.S. interests worldwide. In addition, bombing active nuclear installations, so-called hot sites, carry a significant risk of spewing radioactive toxins into the environment and causing civilian casualties. And finally, a military strike could well generate a nationalist backlash within Iran with the perverse consequences of bolstering the regime. An increasingly plausible outcome is neither breakthrough nor breakdown, but muddling through. That is, another interim agreement which would incorporate what progress has been made and extend the talks. This is plausible given the major political investment both sides have made in nuclear diplomacy and their mutual interest in averting a breakdown with all its uncertain escalatory potential. An anonymous Iranian official recently said that Iran would be willing to work with the United States against ISIS if the Obama administration would be more flexible in the nuclear negotiations. By attempting to link the regional conflict with ISIS to the nuclear talks, Iran risks overplaying its hand. The campaign against the Islamic State, in which the United States and Iran have a mutuality of interests, offers the Tehran regime neither leverage in the nuclear negotiations with the P5+1 nor a reason to hold out for better terms. The United States has given way to diplomatic realities and fallen off its maximalist position of zero enrichment, zero centrifuges spinning. The P5+1 now are offering Iran a straightforward trade-off between technology, a bounded uranium enrichment program, and transparency, assurances that a civil nuclear program is not a masquerade for a weapons program. The Tehran regime should take the deal and not miss a historic opportunity. With that, let me turn to David Sanger, who will provide more detailed assessment of the negotiations themselves.
Well, thank you, Rob, and thank all of you for coming. I think Michael would have been extremely pleased to see this room completely jammed in a session that, while we're here to speak to you, is really much more about him than about anything we can say. I was lucky enough to be working on finishing up The Inheritance here when Michael first joined as a fellow. And you know, at the end of the day, he would sort of come by in either my office or his office, and his endless curiosity for how all of this would play out, his love of the wonderfully ambiguous nature of dealing with the Iranians, the questions of whether or not the specifics of the deal led to a much greater political kind of reconciliation, a subject that my great colleague Mark will take up in a moment, really fascinated him. But he was also wonderfully into the weeds and wonderfully competitive in that way that somebody who's been a reporter all his life can be. When I reported in the book that I wrote after I had done The Inheritance that the United States had been involved in a lengthy cyber sabotage effort against the Iranian nuclear program, one that was really the first use of a cyber weapon by the United States against another state. I think Michael was probably the first person who called me the day that we ran the excerpt in the paper, and his mind had already moved, 3 chess steps out to how the Iranians would respond to this, whether or not they would have to set up their own cyber capability, whether we had set back our effort, whether the publication of the story would help or hurt the negotiations. He was just completely wrapped in all of the elements of this. So I'm really sorry he's not here today, because I'm sure that he would stand up and heartily disagree with several things I'm going to say. So make sure that you discount my comments to that end. As Rob suggested, there are 2 ways to look at this deal. One way, a way that many in Iran look at it and many in Congress look at it, is as a political deal. Don't bother me with the details. I don't want to count centrifuges. I don't want to know how many tons of low enriched uranium and 20% enriched uranium the Iranians have. I want to know if we have the political will on both sides to make a decision that will end 35 years of enmity between these 2 countries and begin to move us into a different place. That's one way to look at the deal. The second way to look at it is the way I think the Israelis would look at it, people at the U.S. weapons labs would look at it, and the way President Obama has to look at it given the things the United States has said and given what he's said about the outlier state, which I think was in an interview with me and Peter Baker. And I'm not sure he's used the phrase since, but in any case, it was an interesting phrase.
I ran with it.
Used. Yeah, good. Take it and go with it. And that is to say, look, it would be wonderful to have a changed relationship with Iran. But in the end, this is as much about physics as it is about politics. That in the end, we have to have the assurance that if they did break out for a bomb or tried to sneak out for a bomb, and break out and sneak out are two different ways we'll describe in a moment, that we would have sufficient notice, that we would have time to react. And our difficulty here, as Rob suggested, is that President Obama's definition of what our ultimate goal is here, which is to stop Iran from having the ability to produce a nuclear weapon, is slightly different from the way the Israelis define it, which is stopping Iran from becoming a threshold state. And in that same interview, where he used outlier state, we asked the president, are you willing to let Iran get to that screwdriver step away? Are you willing to allow them to become a nuclear capable state, and how would you define it? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, I'm not going to parse that issue for you. And it's been important to the administration not to parse it, because once they start doing that, then you end up getting into an argument with Congress, with Israel, with the Saudis, with everybody else about how close is too close. Now, I follow the Yogi Berra rule, which is don't make predictions, especially about the future. But if I had one safe prediction here, it is if there is a deal, it won't be perfect by any means, and it will start that argument that the administration has tried to delay for many, many years about how close is too close. What are you willing to live with? How do you define breakout? Would you have time to respond? Would you have the political will to respond? Would Israel respond without us? Would we get dragged into it? And that's why it's important that if there is a deal, it is strong enough that it can withstand all of those kinds of questions. So it's not really a choice between a political deal and a technical deal. You're going to have both. So let me look briefly at what it would take to get there. And I think Wendy Sherman and Secretary Kerry have both used the same phrase in the past month or two, which is that Iran has 4 pathways to a bomb, and the United States has got to cut off each one. So the first 2 are essentially the same pathway from different places. They are enriching uranium, either at the Natanz plant or at the deep underground plant at Fordo that Iran had hidden for many years, but which it informed the IAEA about moments before President Obama and some fellow leaders revealed its existence in 2009. And that pathway is really one about mathematics. If there is more fuel on hand in Iran, you need to have fewer centrifuges so that that fuel would take longer to produce that fuel into bomb-grade uranium. If you have less fuel in Iran, you can have more centrifuges. And so the story that we ran, 10 days ago that described an interesting temporary agreement that's been reached between Iran, Russia, and the United States to ship out much of its fuel, we don't know yet exactly how much, so that it could be turned into fuel for the nuclear reactor at Bushehr, at which point it's in a form that you can't turn into a weapon, could be the key that unlocks this. It could be one of the technical solutions that unlocks the political equation. It's where those 2 circles meet. But it leaves many things open. First of all, there are some in Congress and some in the Arab states, and certainly many in Israel, who will go back to the original position, which is you can't afford to have any centrifuges or any nuclear fuel in Iran. And that, in fact, was the position of the Bush administration when their line was not one centrifuge spins. Unfortunately, they turned down a deal in which they might conceivably have frozen the Iranians at a few hundred centrifuges. Boy, that seems like a long time ago. And now we're in a negotiation with Iran at a moment when they have about 19,000, about a little fewer than 10,000 of which are actually running. So, as Rob suggested, we're going to have a deal in which they have something spinning. And the question is, can you limit that enough? The politics of this come as a matter of national pride, because the Supreme Leader declared over the summer several times that Iran would eventually have to have a capacity that is roughly 10 times its existing centrifuge capacity. He actually talked about having 190,000 SWU, or separated work units. And if Michael was here today, he could sit down and describe to you much better than I could what those are. But the remarkable thing here is that you had the Supreme Leader, a cleric, talking about the throughput of centrifuges. I don't think I've ever heard a national leader do that. Certainly never heard President Obama go do that. The difficulty this creates is that the negotiators have to find a way to strike a deal that ultimately, at some point in the future, doesn't get in the way of the Supreme Leader's ultimate goal still being the national goal out here. And if he had simply set a number around the existing capacity, I think that would have been possible. But by setting a number that was so high, he's made this difficult. Now, fortunately, he didn't say when. And so one of the big arguments is, how long would this deal last? And when it's over, does Iran just become like Japan? It can produce, there'll be inspectors who come in and out, but it will essentially be lifted of any sanctions. We would essentially trust them with the technology. So that's one big issue. So Pathway 1 and Pathway 2 are Natanz and Fordo. The only difference between the two is that Fordo is a lot harder to bomb than Natanz is. Fordo is deep underground. The United States has one weapon it believes could get at it. The Israelis have no weapon they believe can get at it. And so you've got a slightly different technical problem about having sort of an ultimate deterrent. The third pathway to a bomb is producing plutonium. That would be through the Iraq reactor, a heavy water reactor. For a while this summer, it looked like they had come up with a face-saving idea there of turning this into a research and development plant. I don't think the Americans particularly cared whether it was an R&D facility, a bowling alley, an Iranian Disneyland. They just wanted it to be something where you could not be producing plutonium. And that deal was beginning to crack a bit come the fall, and we'll just have to see on the 24th whether or not they have come up with a solution. But the essential element there is that the Israelis so far have never let one of their adversaries fuel one of these reactors. The Iraqis were about to in 1981. They lost the reactor. The Syrians were preparing to in 2007. That reactor disappeared one night. And so it's important here that they get to a point where they're not actually fueling it. The last element, the last pathway to a bomb, is the one that the fewest people in Congress discuss, gets almost no discussion in the political realm, and yet if you went out to Los Alamos or Livermore or the big Y-12 complex in Tennessee, it's the one that captivates everybody who's got technical knowledge of this, and that is the covert pathway to a bomb. It's much harder to design a negotiated settlement that puts restrictions on a facility that may not exist now, that whether it exists now or not, you don't know about it, or may exist at some point in the future. And so two of the biggest elements of the deal to look at, if they actually get to one in 2 weeks, is whether or not it provides enough assurance that inspectors can track back to the earliest elements of nuclear material. And this was something that fascinated Michael, from the production of yellow cake through to the processing and so forth, so that they're made sure that the fuel never gets diverted to a place we don't know about. Secondly, whether you could have very invasive inspection in all the little shops around Tehran from the Kylie electric plant on, where they produce the centrifuges themselves. And thirdly, and this would be the hardest one for the Iranians because it gets so much at an issue of national pride, whether the IAEA can answer its list of 12 questions that go back to pre-2003 and take you to the current day about what work was done, if any work was done, on what they delicately call the possible military dimensions, but which essentially means work on the design of a weapon. And you've all read about the laptop that was slipped out of Iran in 2005 and other evidence that's come out. The Iranians have said it's all fabrications. But the fact of the matter is that this creates a division between those who say, look, this agreement's all about the future. What we need to do is forget about what the Iranians have done in the past. This is not a truth and reconciliation process here. This is about stopping them in the future. And those who say, look, if you don't understand the full past, then you don't understand how long it would take them once they had the fuel to actually make a weapon. The United States has never declared itself fully on this issue. It has said it's up to the IAEA to certify that these guys are come clean, but they've never quite said how much they're going to press that. You should be looking for that because it gets to the question of how invasive the inspections will be, how embarrassing the questions will be, whether the answers that Iran provides, they would have to provide in public or not. So that's the sort of nuts and bolts of it. To back off just a bit in conclusion here, what are the options if this is, as Rob suggests, a muddle through? And I would never bet against Rob here, just as I would never bet against Michael. It would, I think, be just short of miraculous to have a full agreement by the 24th with all of the details ready to publish, to hand to everybody out, to hand out to everybody. Maybe it will happen. Nobody would be happier to be surprised on that than me, because I could go on to write about something else. But the fact of the matter is, I think it is unlikely. My guess is that there will be some enunciation of areas in which they have come to some agreements, some areas where they can't agree yet, another extension, more discussion, and this becomes a little bit like the Mideast peace process, where you try to resolve a few issues and then you go on and you come back and you try to add on to it, and you hope that you're not backslipping on the ones you've already agreed on. There's some risk here that the same thing will happen as happened in a much smaller agreement in 2009, where everybody stood in front of the cameras, said we have an accord. This involved fuel for the Tehran research reactor, and then it went back to Tehran and the Supreme Leader killed it. So even if you hear there's a deal on the 24th, the question is, will the Supreme Leader have endorsed it prior to that announcement, or will he look for it later? And the same question could be asked here, because the president clearly believes he can do the sanctions lifting by his own authority. There are many in Congress, including a newly elected Republican majority in the Senate, who very much want to take a vote on this. And that could have a big effect on the outcome. If the Iranians don't believe in their hearts that the House and Senate will ever permanently lift the sanctions, they might well hesitate to sign a deal. And who would blame them? If we were in their position, we might well take the same position. If, on the other hand, the president tried to get that lifting early on in the agreements, A, it would probably fail, not just because of Republicans, but because of Democrats, and B, he would not be in a position to have his fingers on the rheostat of sanctions. He wants to lift sanctions as the Iranians perform. And the best way to do that is just suspend them so that if the Iranians stop performing, he can put them back on. That does not lend itself well to congressional votes. So don't look at the 24th as a deadline. Look at the 24th as the end of a quarter in all of this. Because in the political process in Iran and in the United States, there's going to be a lot left. I often say to people, getting this deal doesn't require having one deal. It requires having 3 deals. It's a deal between the U.S. negotiators and the Iranian negotiators. That's actually probably the easiest one of the 3. There's a deal between the president and the foreign minister in Iran and the supreme leader and the IRGC. That's a really tough deal. And there's a deal that has to be struck between our president and our Congress, and that's an equally tough deal. So the 24th is a fascinating marker. I'm sorry Michael won't be around to have it in his book. I'm looking forward to reading those parts of his book that he hadn't already sort of run by me at earlier sections. But I think we've got a long way to go on this one.
Thank you, David. The nuclear negotiations are playing out against the backdrop of sectarian war in Syria and Iraq, which threatened the viability of those states, the campaign against ISIS. To explore how this regional tumult is affecting the negotiations, we'll turn now to Mark.
Thanks, David, for depressing everyone thoroughly, especially by comparing it to the Middle East peace process. But it's a real honor to be here. And when Rob asked me to be on the panel and said they were doing it in honor of Michael, of course I said yes, although I said, the Iran nuclear negotiations and the details and the intricacies are not a primary topic of my coverage, and there are people far more expert like Rob, like David, like Jay Solomon, who couldn't be with us today to talk. And he said, well, there's certainly other aspects of this that you are more familiar with, and and at the risk of violating the Washington rule, which is just get up and talk even though you don't know what you're talking about, I figured I would definitely stick to what I was more familiar with, which I think is a critical part of everything we've just discussed, which is how what is happening now in the Middle East really is central to these negotiations. And I just want to say that I spent 15 months at the Wilson Center. Sort of some of the 15 of the best months I've had professionally, and working on my book. And I can't think of my time at the Wilson Center without also thinking of Michael. He's an integral part of my memories of this place. From the discussion, we started out sort of sharing offices close by, and then we would meet for lunch, and then we also shared a terrific research assistant, Jessica Schulberg, who's here, and so Michael and I fought over her time, and because she was that good, and just the conversations I had with him about these ongoing endless negotiations and how to incorporate them into his book. And the memories I have would be there would be another round of negotiation that was announced, whether it be in Vienna or Moscow or some other place. And Michael would, he was so torn because he would say, I just got to stay. I got to finish this book, but I really want to be there. And something big may happen, and I think I can go. I think I can, pay and just get on a plane and go. And I'd say, well, Michael, do you think you go? You could get really good access. They let you in. He said, no, they're not going to talk to anybody. We're going to be in a room and we're just going to be shut out. But he realized that being there was important, and he was a reporter, and that is, I think, the first rule of being a reporter is that you have to be there to find the story. And Michael truly believed that, and he couldn't imagine, this was a topic that was so central to his coverage, not being there for whatever was happening critically at that time. And I think that was to his credit, that he just felt like he always had to be where the action was. And that's really what is a really strong memory for me about Michael. And on the issue of ISIS, Iran, how all of the recent events in the Middle East play into what David and Rob just discussed. I mean, I think that the last 6 months, to put it mildly, just made everything a lot more complicated. Rob said at the outset that, it would be hard to imagine several months ago or a year ago having a discussion on this topic without the prospect of a possible airstrikes or a military action in Iran. I think also equally implausible 5, 6, 7 months ago was this idea that we could have a discussion on this topic, and one central part of it would be that Iran and the United States are working fundamentally close with very common interests on a critical issue in the Middle East. And that's ISIS, and that's the fight against ISIS. I think if you just back up for a second, you had, before the last 6 months, before the summer, you had this sort of calcified set of issues on Iran, Iraq, Syria, that meant that, that things were pretty intractable and weren't going to move. Just to set the picture, you had a bloody civil war in Syria that went on and on with a horrendous loss of life that Iran was directly invested in. But clearly the Obama administration was not. The Obama administration, President Obama himself said time and time again that this was not a fight that the United States could make an appreciable difference in. And so, therefore, it was his role to keep the United States out of it. We heard in so many interviews, he would compare the Syrian conflict to, an African civil war or something that was really marginal when the U.S. looked at its own interests. And that was the civil war against Assad, the effort to oust Assad. And we wrote however many stories about how there was this debate within the administration about whether to do more, whether to arm the rebels, whether the CIA should do it or the Pentagon should do it. But fundamentally, at the center of it, President Obama never really believed it. He didn't believe that it was that important. And on the other hand, you had Iran, which was clearly heavily invested in supporting the Assad regime, along with the Russians, but flowing money, personnel, troops, weapons to the Assad regime because it saw keeping the Assad regime alive was central to Iran's interests. So there was this real mismatch of interests between Tehran and the United States. And in some ways, that allowed, at least from the United States' point of view, to compartmentalize the issue. You could compartmentalize the nuclear negotiations from the broader issue of Syria, the violence in the Middle East, because the United States was not all that invested. And David or Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, really the priority of the administration was getting a deal with Iran. This was going to be part of President Obama's legacy. Maybe the linchpin of President Obama's foreign policy legacy was dealing with the Iranian program. And the really lack of interest in other aspects of the Middle East, I think, allowed the administration to be so singularly focused on that. But then June, July happened, and what we saw was the push by ISIS to go into northern Iraq, to take over Mosul, to make a march on Baghdad. Already they had carved out large parts of Syria, but that was not really on the radar of at the senior levels of the administration because, again, it was all part of the messy Syrian civil war that the United States was determined to stay out of. But then it became an Iraq problem, and it became a real question of, does ISIS threaten Baghdad, where the United States, for obvious reasons, has a lot more invested, given the events of the last 10 years. So we now see the United States once again directly militarily involved in Iraq and also with airstrikes in Syria. This has totally changed the landscape of how we deal with these various partners. You now have, instead of Assad being the enemy supported by Iran, you now have a common enemy that everyone is lined up against. So it is the one enemy that Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Pope, the United States, sounds like a joke, that they're all basically have come out against ISIS because ISIS is seen by so many as such a significant threat. So that has really scrambled to some degree the picture and changed the calculus for the various parties. And it's no longer, as in many ways, as simple as it was back before ISIS made its advance. So because for that reasons, I think that that is going to have at least a tangential impact on the negotiations that Rob and David talked about, because the U.S. interests have shifted. The U.S. now has as much of an interest in the perception of the Obama administration, as much of an interest in beating back ISIS as it does denuclearizing Iran. The attention now paid at the highest levels of the National Security Council to ISIS, to the impact in Syria, the impact in Iraq, is you can't even compare it today as it was 6 months ago. I mean, there was very, very little attention comparatively compared to what it is today. So how does Iran interpret that? I think it could be interpreted in a couple different ways. And Jay, who unfortunately isn't with us, Jay Solomon, wrote this great story last week about Obama's letter, and Obama's letter reaching out to the Iranians for help with ISIS, but also a discussion about how the war against ISIS will impact the ongoing negotiations. I think Iranians, as Rob indicated, might interpret this as leverage. That, okay, the United States now is invested in this region in a way it wasn't before. It now needs Iran, because if it considers ISIS such a fundamental threat to the region, it knows that it would need Iran's help in order to beat back ISIS. And so my guess is that the Iranians at least see this as more leverage on their part than they had 6-7 months ago, because the United States does need them to some degree. I don't see anytime soon direct military cooperation between the United States and Iran, but I would certainly guess that there is some, if not direct, but indirect intelligence discussion going on, not intelligent discussion about intelligence between the two sides, because that's what intelligence officials do. They try to figure out what the other side's up to, especially when there is some common ground. It's a little bit of speculation on my part, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. So there is this common interest that I think Iran might interpret as leverage, and as Rob said, could overplay, because they could think, well, this is their chance to get the most of what they can get because the United States needs them against ISIS. But there is a risk here as well, and I think that the danger that faces Iran is that not only overplaying the hand, but also completely misplaying its own strengths. Iran is overstretched right now. Not only do they now have a regime in Syria to help prop up, which they're still trying to do, they now have to deal with the ISIS threat in Iraq. There's been some reports that the Quds force doesn't have the manpower to do what it does in Iraq, and they're relying on Iranian conventional artillery along the border of Iraq to fight ISIS. So Iran does not have limitless military resources, and they've already got this one flailing regime in Syria to support, and they presumably do not see the prospect of having to fight a years-long war against ISIS as something that they relish because of their own limitations. The other thing is that the other reason why time isn't necessarily on the side of Iran is because of, as either Rob or David alluded to, the price of oil. So the price of oil is sinking. This is obviously putting pressure on Iran because the more it sinks, the more it's going to feel even more the grip of the sanctions. And so that would be another reason why Iran shouldn't necessarily think that just because the United States needs them for ISIS, they can play out the clock for longer and longer. So just a couple points to close. I think that as President Obama has indicated, this war against ISIS is going to be long. It is going to be something that's probably kind of low grade for some period of time. It's going to, there's no one is predicting that ISIS can be defeated easily. So in that case, on the bright side, it looks like the United States and Iran might have common interests on a very significant subject for a long time to come, as long as this war is fighting, because as long as ISIS is a threat, the United States and Iran will continue to have common interest. But the big question then remains at the end, and I don't think anyone is really dealing with this head on because we don't really know, is what is the future of Assad? For the time being, the decision has been made that ISIS is the proximate threat. It is the threat the United States wants to deal with in an air campaign. It now wants to train rebel forces in Syria to fight. And then somewhere down the road, we'll deal with the Assad problem. But when that happens, however many years from now that is, that's what once again could put the United States and Iran on a collision course, because then once again their interests will come head on. And hopefully before that happens, there'll be a nuclear deal.
Thank you, Mark. Before opening it to the floor, one or two sort of threads of the discussion that I'd like to pursue. The first is the question of whether the nuclear agreement is linked to other issues or compartmentalized. You know, Einstein kind of famously said that politics is more difficult than physics. In the case of the Iranian nuclear challenge, start with David. How do you view the linkage issue? I mean, I argued that compartmentalizing the agreement may be the way of finessing this gap between the technical and the political, that an agreement on technical grounds that allows Iran to retain its hedge but provides a long enough breakout period to the United States to assure that it's not close to weaponization, that there's space on the technological continuum to reach an agreement. And then that workout does suggest a political narrative that's not unattractive from both sides. Iran can say we stood up to bullying, we've got, you know, we've got sanctions relief, we've preserved Iran's rights. America could say they're not a screwdriver, turn away, we've got assurances on that. Do you see that type of political narrative possibly playing and bringing the November 24th negotiations to some type of a resolution?
I do think that's a narrative that will bring it to some kind of resolution. Whether it can bring it there by November 24th is another question. I thought it was interesting at the United Nations in September that both Foreign Minister Zarif and Secretary Kerry were both saying these issues are not linked. We are not going to do a trade-off of the nuclear deal for cooperation on ISIS and so forth. And I think that was the right approach. It was the right approach for the United States because a deal on dealing with ISIS is a temporary thing of a year or two or three and may get executed or not. But the half-life of a deal on ISIS is a lot shorter than the half-life of either uranium or plutonium, and therefore they need something that is long-lasting on the nuclear side. Now, that doesn't mean the two are completely unrelated, but to trade off the nuclear for uncertain gains elsewhere, I think would have been unwise for the U.S. I also think it would have been unwise for the Iranians because they're feeling under pressure as well here. As Mark suggested, they're stretched extremely thin. Oil prices are dropping. If you believe the projections that are out there, they're going to drop some more. It's dropping fast enough that you even wonder whether the Russians really want this deal to happen, because the last thing they might want to have happen is for the Iranians to come back on the market with more oil and bring the price down even faster. So if you are the supreme leader and you're playing this out, I think that you want to keep the possibility of a cooperation against ISIS out there in hopes that it will give you some advantage, as Mark suggests. But you don't want that to be terribly explicit. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if you had a model here, think of President Kennedy and removing the missiles in Turkey. You know, they were separate announcements. They were 6 months apart. There was complete deniability. And if I was the United States or the Iranians, I'd probably want to keep it the same way.
Mark, in your presentation, you mentioned that in Iraq, the United States and Iran are kind of tacitly in alignment in supporting the central government, which is perceived kind of in the broader Middle East as sort of a Shiite government. And in Syria, their interests begin to diverge over the future of Assad. And I know it's a the U.S. policy toward Assad is sort of a current point of debate about whether the United States will make the overthrow of the Assad regime a priority or not relative to the campaign against ISIS. How do you see that tension playing out over time, particularly when you have U.S. forces in Iraq as forward operators assisting the Iraqis, where you also have Iranian forces there, and they may be coming up into proximity with each other, and there's a chance of inadvertent, military, some type of inadvertent action between two sides that run up against each other inside Iraq. How do you see these issues getting worked out over time?
Well, I mean, that you raise this sort of very intriguing prospect of American forces in some capacity in Iraq, somehow not fighting alongside, but in some kind of at least coordination with whatever Iran is doing against a common enemy. I mean, the current debate, obviously, in Iraq is to what extent the U.S. advisors there are going to be engaged in combat. And that is very much a disagreement depending on whether you talk to someone at the Pentagon or whether you talk to someone at the White House. Certainly, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has indicated that these advisors, in order to do the advising that the Pentagon envisions, they will be working with Iraqi forces on the ground, calling in airstrikes, that type of thing. That raises some very interesting prospects for whatever they are doing and whatever Iran is doing to beat back ISIS in Iraq. I think the real question, that we can't answer at this point, is to what extent the Syria, what is the ground picture in Syria going to look like? I mean, Obama has ruled out boots on the ground and American boots on the ground in Syria. It is hard to imagine that he is going to go back on that during his final 2 years, but a lot can happen in 2 years, and so the question is, if there was a military presence in Syria, who will they be fighting, and to what extent does this issue of does Iran and the United States once again go on a collision course because Assad remains at the center of the picture. And it's in my mind, and the reporting I've seen, I still haven't quite figured out how the whatever force that is being trained to be the boots on the ground in Syria, the rebel force that's being trained in various places, what they're going to do and who they're going to fight, and how that is going to be worked out without either American presence or the presence of another Arab nation there. So I think that if you can imagine, Iraq is actually an easier thing to envision than Syria, which is just a far more complicated prospect and much greater potential for once again the U.S. and Iran to be at odds.
Thank you. Let's open it to the floor now for questions and comments. If speakers could please identify themselves. Yes, Diana Negroponte first. Thank you.
Thank you. Diana Negroponte from Woodrow Wilson. Rosatom announced earlier this week that they have agreed to construct 8 new nuclear reactors in Iran. Whether this is bidding or whether there's an actual agreement is uncertain. But what are the impacts of that announcement? 4 nuclear reactors first, followed by 4 others for the nuclear talks with the US and the 5.
Give that one to David. I mean, David, you broke a story earlier in the last week about the possibility of fissile material going to Russia, and now this new development that they may build reactors, because one of the issues has been Iran is spinning, these centrifuges for nuclear fuel that don't exist. So this opens the door to the possibility that there might actually be some practical needs for the fuel cycle program. What's your take?
Well, Diana, it's an excellent question, and I think that the upside of this for the Iranians is that one of the weaknesses in their argument until now has been we're enriching fuel for a set of reactors that do not exist. Their only reactor right now is the one at Bushehr. The Russians supply it and will be supplying it through 2021. Now, the agreement that was announced was a bit vague. It talked initially about 2 reactors, the possibility of moving up to 8. We know from our own experience here in the United States, we know from the Japanese experience and the European experience, that it's a lot easier to announce reactors than to build reactors. Although it would be interesting to see if a not in my backyard movement crops up in Iran. That would be a good story, an interesting story. What it does do, though, is that it creates a rationale of sorts under which the Iranians could justify going up to to the Supreme Leader's 190,000 centrifuges or the existing technology as a rationale for fueling these when they get built. We know it takes so long to build them that they would have plenty of time to go do this even after an agreement was over. So to that degree, it helps. The other side of that, though, is that the Iranians right now are incredibly inefficient producers of uranium. And if they wanted to do this at a much cheaper price, they would just buy the uranium, low-enriched uranium, the nuclear fuel, on the open market. There is a glut of it, particularly after the Japanese closed down so many of their reactors following Fukushima, but there was a glut even before that time. And so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the Iranians to be producing this inefficiently, shipping it to Russia, having it fabricated into this specialty fuel to go fuel these reactors. But if, in fact, it is a way of maintaining control and people can see what they're producing, if it's regularly leaving the country, we have a relatively high confidence level that the Russians are doing this correctly, then it's a potential solution. And there's no reason that the Iranians shouldn't be allowed to go ahead and produce this, assuming that there's an understanding about what happens to the spent fuel out the back, so that it doesn't turn into plutonium fuel.
Yeah. Barbara Slavin.
Thanks. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council, and may I add my sympathies about Michael. He was a member of our Iran task force and very, very helpful in that regard. Again, to David, possible military dimensions. How important is it that this be clarified? Are you surprised that obviously nothing would happen until November 24th? Is it necessary for the findings to be publicized at some point? Could they be kept quietly? Could this be a long process that, does not lose face for the Iranians, who insist that they never intended to build nuclear weapons? Thanks.
It's a very good question, because this is, I think, in many ways the toughest issue for the Iranians, because if you believe the intelligence, and there's always a big if there, prior to 2004, there was something that resembled the Manhattan Project, if you believe that intelligence. And we won't know that until you get that amount of data. There are sort of three levels of the answer to your question. One is, should the Iranians have to respond to this because it's an IAEA investigation, an obligation, and they've already said that they would answer the questions. Secondly, and I think for my own personal view, not that as a reporter it makes a particular difference, but if you're going to enforce IAEA norms in the future against other states, I think giving somebody a pass is a little bit problematic, because then you've got to justify it the next time and the time after that. The second question is, do you make it public? That adds to the embarrassment question. In a post-WikiLeaks, post-Snowden world, operating with an organization that has 180 some odd members, the way the IAEA does, whose own control over information has been, bless them, a little bit less than full. It's been sort of the Mark and David Full Employment Act over the years to, can you consider how much information, and you too when you were a full-time reporter, and today in the work you do, the IAEA, as you know, is a very important source of information, whether they intend to be at times or not. I can't imagine that information would stay secret forever. It boggles the mind to imagine that. And the third question is, even if you don't reveal the history, do you want to make sure that the IAEA is constantly interviewing the scientists who worked on those programs to make sure that they are gainfully employed on something other than a nuclear weapons project? And so far, the IAEA has not been able to interview any of them, and the Iranians have made the quite good point that when their nuclear scientists show up in public someplace, the odd sticky bomb ends up on the side of their car. And so they have some good reasons not to want to reveal who their scientists are.
We have an overflow room, and let me take a question from there. We talked about the possibility of the muddle-through scenario, as I put it, sort of a new interim deal. Let's talk a bit about the politics of that, both here and in Iran. If there is an interim deal that sort of pockets whatever progress has been made and opens the door to future negotiations on outstanding issues, how will that play, here and potentially there? It would be a delicate balancing act because on the one hand, you'd want to maintain the sanction structure to maintain the pressure on Iran, but there would have to be something in it for Iran to kind of go along with it. The politics here, particularly with the change in Congress, are complicated. On the Iranian side, it's the politically loaded question that we've discussed it to be. How do you both see kind of an interim option sort of playing out if that's the outcome on November 24th?
Go ahead. I think this would be tough with Congress because a partial deal by necessity will not have a whole lot of specificity about timelines and sharp measures. And so you're in the position of lifting some sanctions without complete clarity, unless some complete clarity is announced about what the Iranians do in return. And I think for the Iranians, it would be difficult as well, because presumably the U.S. position and the P5+1 position would be, we can't discuss permanent lifting of sanctions until you have a permanent deal. And I'm not sure how much the Iranians want to live with a temporary lifting of sanctions that could be easily reversed. And then I don't know what the rest of the region would think. I imagine they would be pretty nervous, but that's more Mark's territory.
Yeah, I think they would be very nervous, and I also think that any attempt by Iran to read the U.S. political situation would be quite difficult. Like what it means for them, the Republican takeover of the Senate, just as it is for our own political analysts to read the political situation. I think that whether Iran sees benefit or risk of the new Congress, I think that I think once again it goes to Rob's point of it's important for them to realize the opportunity when they have it.
I think we'll close it there. I'll now turn to my colleague Hala Esfandiari, the director of the Center's Middle East program, for closing remarks. And I should add that it was the Middle East program of the Wilson Center that has sponsored today's event, and we thank Hala for that.
Thank you, Rob. Special thank to our two speakers. You couldn't have done a better job. I wish Michael had been with us to have shared his views. I know he would have loved the discussions. In the last piece he authored for Breaking Defense on May 19 of this year, he thought the two sides faced intractable differences and had run into a brick wall. When I read this, the next day I started arguing with him, and I told him, I think it's a mud wall and not a brick wall. And, neither I was able to convince him, nor he was able to convince me. He was not 100% pessimistic, but he was not hopeful about the possibilities of a deal by November 24th. He was still a skeptic when Rob and I and our colleague Aaron David Miller saw him shortly before he passed away. He was not interested at all to talk about his health. He was interested in talking about the nuclear negotiations and what was the latest. Michael, let us recall, was intimately familiar with the details of the negotiations. He was present at almost all the meetings of the negotiators in Europe. He knew and had talked to most of the principal, Yukiya Amano, Bill Burns, Javad Zarif, and Sergei Ryabkov. And I remember when he went there to talk to the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, I argued with him and I said, you don't have to go just because he wants to talk to you. He said, no, this is an opportunity I don't want to miss. And every time there was a negotiators meeting, he wanted to be there and was there. And in the last 6-7 months, I tried to talk him out of attending the meeting, especially the one in Geneva, which I think was his last meeting in July of this year, but he went. And I'm certain that if he were still with us, he would have been filing stories from Oman over the weekend. Michael was working on a book on the history of the Iran nuclear negotiations at the time of his death. He showed me the first 60 pages because I constantly nagged him and I said, I want you to show me something. So one day he walked in and gave me 60 pages and he opens the book with his one and only visit to Iran, charting the difficult road that lay ahead. And he was hoping to complete the book by December. Alas, he did not live to complete it. But if we at the Wilson Center, his colleagues, will get hold of the manuscript, we will make sure to finish it for him. But book or no book, we at the center, his colleagues, friends, and editors will always remember Michael's measured, insightful observations as the negotiations with Iran go forward. So we are very thankful that you're all here. We are very thankful to the family who joined us this afternoon. And please join us to a reception which is in the dining room. Thank you.
We actually did it right on time. That was great fun. You have like actual.
Give me 1 second.